This video is sponsored by the book summary app, Blinkist. Also, for those interested, you'll find more insights on philosophical topics like the ones covered in this video in my new book of collected works, The Art of Living a Meaningless Existence, which you can also find through its respective link in the description. When it happens, happiness can often feel more troubling than comforting. It feels like something is not quite right. It almost intimates an end, a sort of death. For many of us, happiness does not feel like home. What we seem to prefer, rather, is the strange paradoxical comfort of misery's discomfort, the soothing darkness of melancholy, the striving agitation of discontent. How is it, or why is it, that we can be so intelligent, so aware, so equipped, perhaps successful and well off in the traditional societal sense, and yet we can still feel so unhappy? We appear to be unable to obtain what we want and set out to accomplish, perfect happiness and contentment and peace. Perhaps this is because, in part, we actually do not want these things. Perhaps we are far less aware of what we really want and how our mind really works. If right now you could push a button and feel nothing but bliss for the rest of your life, or push a button and never feel misery or discontent ever again, would you do it? If not, why? What does this suggest about what you really want and value in life? If experiencing the so-called ideal all the time is not ideal, and never experiencing the so-called undesirable is undesirable, are these things really as they seem? In Aldous Huxley's novel, Brave New World, John says, "But I don't want comfort. I want God. I want poetry. I want real danger. I want freedom. I want goodness. I want sin." Arguably, like a tyrannical government concealing the truth from its people to maintain order and function of its state, we are told by our conscious mind that we desire happiness and that happiness is the goal, while simultaneously, our conscious mind conceals from us that our real desire is a sort of unhappiness, a continual state of discontent, and all the states and views that grow out of its muddy but fertile soil. The pursuit of happiness seems to be a mirage created by the opposing temperatures of our conscious and unconscious minds. The heat of our conscious desires and hopes met with the cold indifference of our unconscious mind's continually unsatisfiable nature. This might sound bleak and absurd, and perhaps it is on some level, but perhaps it isn't totally. 20th century philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein described himself as being miserable his entire life. He was afflicted by depression, anxiety, anger, self-loathing, loneliness, and an unyielding, impossible desire for perfection and philosophical truth, of which he of course never found. He frequently discussed with others and wrote in his diary about these afflictions throughout his life. And yet, on his deathbed, reportedly, his last words were, "Tell them I've had a wonderful life." This final testament and endorsement of his life raises the question, how could someone who lived their life in misery also claim they lived a wonderful life? What does this mean about what a wonderful life is or could be, and how happiness and misery play a role in its development? The dichotomy of Wittgenstein's life and his final testimony at the end of it reveals its own remarkable philosophical insight, the strange divergence between day-to-day happiness and the quality of the net outcome of one's life. Of course, there are different degrees of misery, some that are not in the category of functional. Melancholy, discontent, and the sort of existential suffering of all conscious being is likely different than depression or a lifetime of overdrawn misery, and it isn't always obvious which is which. And none of this is to say that there isn't anything good or enjoyable throughout life that isn't worth being happy about, and nor is it to say that there are not things and methods that generally make life better. Things like diet, exercise, good sleep, financial stability, and at least a few close friends and loved ones can make a substantial difference and ought to be optimized as best as one can. But in the context of a purposeful life, it is to say that perhaps a good life is not one without misery, but rather it is one that is often seeping with it. Consider the creation of a great work of art, or the creative process more broadly. The creative process can often be seen as some enchanted process of a divine burst of inspiration and talent. What it more typically is, however, is a process of continual dissatisfaction. A great piece of creative work does not merely emerge out of a burst of inspiration and effort, but rather a collection of these bursts, forced or natural, in which most amount to nothing, something the creator finds unsatisfactory. The creative person, however, continues on through the process until they evolve the work into something satisfactory, at least enough. One might be immersed and perhaps in some sort of flow state during certain stages of this process, which is arguably some amount pleasant, but broadly, the creative process is beset with uncertainty, self-doubt, misery, stress, and discontent. Moreover, the degree of how great a creative work is often largely depends on how unhappy the creator was with their work throughout the process, all the way up until the final form of it. After countless brushstrokes, key pushes, pages written, answers attempted, and so on, all of which were deemed as not good enough. By the end, relief and perhaps pride in some form of meaningfulness is likely to be experienced, exhaustion-fueled willingness to move on, but not happiness, not in the traditional sense at least. Happiness never really enters the stage, at least not for long. It appears on the program booklet, but its character never really makes much of an appearance. And yet, the show is still incredible, somehow still desirable and worthwhile. If persevered through, the creative person almost always returns to do it again and again and again. What is life if not merely the greatest art piece we will all create? The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche argued that the process of continually defining, striving, and achieving new ideals and goals in life is the means through which an individual can achieve a meaningful and worthwhile life. He referred to this concept as self-overcoming. In order to achieve and sustain this process, he suggested that one must continually set up an ever-evolving ideal version of themselves with which they can aim and strive toward. He would term this ideal self the Übermensch. By continually creating a new image of the Übermensch and then recurrently going through a process of self-destruction and self-creation toward it, the individual, for Nietzsche, justifies life's suffering and develops personal meaning and greatness through it. What is needed throughout this process, though, is a continual sense of dissatisfaction and misery, a sense that the work of art of one's own life is not yet good enough. In this paradigm, the basis of meaning is self-creation and self-improvement. The basis of creation and improvement, however, is desire, and the basis of desire is discontentment. And here is where the sort of reflexive, interdependent relationship between desire and misery emerges. If we agree with this paradigm in a sort of strange way, we desire desire's continuation, and we need discontentment and the misery that stems from it for this to occur. The end of desire is the end of sorrow, wrote the Buddha. And so, desire and sorrow are, in this way, inexorably interlocked, two sides of the same coin. Thus, in a strange way, if it is true that we want to persist our desire, we desire this sort of existential sorrow. In an even stranger way, by not having our desire satisfied, we satisfy our ultimate desire, the desire for the continuation of desire. If, rather, happiness is the highest possible goal, then this form of meaning and agency is undermined. In The Gay Science, Nietzsche wrote, "When I think of the desire to do something, how it continually tickles and stimulates millions of young Europeans who cannot endure themselves in all their ennui, I conceive that there must be a desire in them to suffer something in order to derive from the suffering a worthy motive for acting, for doing something. Distress is necessary. This young world desires that there should arrive from the outside, not happiness, but misfortune. And their imagination is already busy beforehand to form a monster out of it, so that they may afterwards be able to fight with a monster." Arguably, whether we are familiar with Nietzsche's ideas or not, a vast majority of us in the modern Western world live our lives with at least some sense of and calibration with this paradigm. And so, if and when happiness does occur in our lives, or we obtain the conditions that would allow for it to, many of us do not accept it fully. Instead, we might sabotage it, we might reject it, we might look for what's still wrong, or contrive something being wrong if there isn't anything. Philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer wrote, "The safest way of not being very miserable is not to expect to be very happy." Perhaps a more apt version is, "The safest way of not being very miserable is to realize your taste for misery." Of course, the idea of liking, justifying, or pursuing sorrow and discontent isn't without reasonable critiques. If every time your life gets better, it's still not good enough and essentially feels the same, no matter how much better life gets, if it feels the same, how much better is it really? And what is the point of life if not to be at least some amount happy as reasonably often as possible? Perhaps it is a matter of being as happy as possible while living the most meaningfully interesting life possible, reaping and persisting through suffering, and enjoying happiness presently and fully when it comes and when we can. Like most things, it is perhaps an impossible constant balancing act unique to the valuation and strength of each individual. Ultimately, though, it seems that if we want engagement, wonder, meaning, greatness, and a continual sense of forward motion, to some degree, we should embrace our desire for discontent, until finally at the end of our life, when we have done everything we could to produce the greatest piece of art that is our being, and we are exhausted and ready to move on, we are able to say, "Tell them, I've had a wonderful life." This video was sponsored by Blinkist. On average, John reads about 1 book per month. Emmett spends around the same amount of time each month learning from books as John. Over a single year, John read about 10 books. Emmett, however, learned from 327 books. Emmett was also able to explore tons of different books and authors, not only in his favorite subjects, but also on other subjects that he was able to discover that he was interested in. How is this possible, though, if they both spent the same amount of time? Emmett used the book summary app, Blinkist, which condenses over 5,000 nonfiction books into around 15-minute summaries. Using Blinkist, Emmett was able to listen to and read summaries during his downtime, his commute, while he worked out, and so on, even while he was offline, easily able to refresh himself on key parts of his favorite books and discover new ones, saving plenty of time to still read complete books throughout the year when he found the ones he was most interested in. In a single day, he learned from several books, including Atomic Habits by James Clear and Essentialism by Greg McKeown, and learned practical ways to consider and cut out the metaphorical fat from his life, focus his priorities on what matters to him, and better understand habit building toward what does. Additionally, he also had time to discover and explore his new interest in books on personal finance. All the while, John, on the same day, remained on the one book he had been reading, mostly on the same subjects he always read. If you're interested in going the same route as Emmett, Blinkist is available for you as well. And if you use the link in the description, you'll receive 1 free week of unlimited access, as well as 25% off a premium membership. The free 7-day trial can be canceled at any time within the trial period. And of course, as always, thank you so much for watching in general, and see you next video.